When the city began selling feelings the way it sold coffee, I was the first person to learn what silence costs. I worked night shifts at a company called Lumen Line, where executives wore warm smiles and carried cold contracts, and where our product was a thin silver ear cuff that translated microsignals, pulse changes, breath patterns, pupil drift into probable intent. Marketing called it empathy. Lawyers called it analytics. I called it trouble, because the first time I tested the cuff on myself, I discovered something terrifying. It didn't just infer what people wanted. It predicted what they would do when nobody was watching. That was how I heard my manager's hidden plan before he spoke it aloud, and that was how I understood that my future had already been assigned to me as the useful, disposable woman who would take the blame when a powerful man failed. My name is Mira Sato, and I wasn't supposed to last at Lumen Line. I came from the River District, a place the glossy billboards never photographed, and I had been hired through a scholarship program that looked generous on paper and predatory in practice. The scholarship paid my tuition, but it also chained me to a service contract that could be extended if I made any trouble. In other words, my freedom was on a timer controlled by people who called themselves mentors. The day our CEO announced we would pilot empathy cuffs in family courts so judges could measure sincerity in custody hearings, the room applauded. I heard the hidden thoughts beneath the applause. Revenue, influence, immunity. And then I heard something else, threaded through the noise like a wire under carpet. A plan to frame someone. Me. It started with a dinner invitation. Celebrate the pilot, my manager Rowan said, acting friendly, acting proud. The invite included a restaurant I couldn't afford and a guest list I didn't recognize. When I arrived, the table was filled with lawyers, a city council aide, and a woman with an expensive laugh who introduced herself as Talia Wren. Talia leaned close and asked me softly whether it was true. I had modified the cuff's scoring model without authorization. Her tone was syrup. The intent under it was a blade. She wanted a confession on record. Rowan watched me with the expectant calm of a man confident the room would do his violence for him. I smiled, ordered water, and pretended not to notice the small red dot on the table centerpiece, the kind used in hidden cameras. They weren't inviting me to dinner. They were inviting me to a narrative. In the past, I might have panicked. I might have argued in circles, trying to prove innocence to people who had already bought my guilt. But the empathy cuff had changed me in one essential way. It taught me to stop listening to words and start listening to intent. And intent is predictable. People who trap you follow scripts. The trick is to read the script faster than they can flip pages. So I asked a question instead. I looked at Talia and said, "Before I answer, can I confirm you're recording this as part of a regulatory review?" She blinked just once, but the cuff translated it into surprise. Then recalibration. Rowan's pulse sped up. Under his smile, his intent flashed. Deny, deflect, accuse. I continued politely. Because if this is a review, the proper channel is compliance, and I'd like the request in writing. The lawyer on Rowan's left cleared his throat. The counsel aide shifted. In that moment, the dinner table became what it really was, a shaky conspiracy. Rowan tried to regain control. "Mira, don't be dramatic," he said, laughing as if I were a child. Inside, his intent spiked. Push her, make her emotional, make her look unstable. So I stayed calm. "I'm not dramatic," I replied. "I'm cautious." The cuff measures intent, right? Then you'll understand why I'm cautious. Talia's smile tightened. Her intent read like smoke. She wanted me to feel ashamed, to feel small, to surrender. Instead, I excused myself to the restroom, where I removed the cuff and placed it in a signal-blocking pouch. I knew the pilot was corrupt, but I hadn't known how they would move. Now I did. Back at my apartment, I pulled the project logs I'd been quietly backing up for months, not because I was paranoid, but because I was trained by poverty to expect traps. The logs showed unusual access patterns. Rowan's credentials used at 2:13 a.m., edits made to the model's bias thresholds, test results overwritten. If they blamed me, it would be with his fingerprints wearing my gloves. I needed allies, but allies are expensive in a system designed to keep people isolated. My first call was to June Park, a quiet engineer who always asked uncomfortable questions in meetings and got ignored for it. June answered on the second ring. I told him only what was necessary. "They're staging a fall. I can prove it. Will you help?" He paused, then said, "I've been waiting for someone to say that out loud." Together we built a mirror. We copied the full training data set, the model checkpoints, and the audit trails into an environment Rowan couldn't touch. We wrote a simple verifier that compared outputs against cryptographic hashes. Then we discovered the worst part. The cuff's intent score was being tuned to punish specific demographics. People from the River District, people with anxiety disorders, people who didn't speak in the calm cadence associated with wealth. In family court, that would mean poor parents losing children because their fear would be labeled deception. What Rowan had framed as innovation was actually a machine for laundering prejudice into law. We took our findings to compliance. Compliance listened with the solemn patience of a department that exists to protect the company, not the truth. They said they would investigate. They thanked us for our diligence. Then they asked for our copies of the evidence. June refused politely. I watched the compliance director's intent spike. Secure control, bury story, protect brand. That was when I realized the system's top was rotten too. So we changed tactics. We didn't go higher inside the company. We went sideways into daylight. I contacted a journalist named Sarah Quinn, famous for destroying politicians with boring documents. Sarah's first message was blunt. If you're lying, I'll expose you. If you're telling the truth, I'll protect you. Send proof. I sent the hashes, the diffs, and a timeline of access logs. Then I waited for the part of the story that always hurts. The retaliation. 2 days later, my badge stopped working. Security escorted me out while Rowan watched from a glass-walled office. Expression sympathetic. Intent delighted. HR sent an email claiming I had violated data policies. The scholarship office notified me that my service contract was under review. In other words, they were trying to erase my options. That night, a car idled outside my building for an hour. A stranger followed me to the corner store. I didn't call the police. The police in the River District were trained to treat fear as a nuisance. Instead, I called my mother, who worked 2 jobs and still found time to be relentless. She told me, "If they want you quiet, make noise that can't be ignored." So I did something I'd never done. I asked the city to watch. Sarah published the first article at 7 a.m. on a Monday, the time when outrage spreads fastest, because people want a reason to feel righteous before coffee. The headline didn't mention my name. It didn't need to. It mentioned children, courts, and a device that claimed to measure sincerity while secretly measuring class. By noon, the mayor's office demanded an inquiry. By evening, Lumen Line's stock dropped. Rowan panicked. His intent spiked so hard the cuff would have screamed. He called me from a private number. "Mira," he said softly, "we can fix this. Come back. We'll make you whole." Underneath, threaten, bargain, isolate. I recorded the call. I said, "Put it in writing." He hung up. The next day, he tried to blame June, then tried to blame a contractor, then tried to blame a bad data set. But the hashes didn't lie, and the logs didn't forget. When the State Tech Commission subpoenaed Lumen Line's servers, June and I handed over our mirror as an independent baseline. It was the difference between an internal story and an external fact. Rowan resigned before he could be fired, the way cowards exit burning rooms and call it strategy. Compliance was restructured. The family court pilot was suspended. A class action suit formed, not only for the bias but for the people already harmed during the limited trial. My scholarship contract was voided under public pressure, and for the first time in my life, a timer that had been counting down on my freedom disappeared. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, and then I felt clear. Sarah asked if I wanted to be a public face. I declined. I didn't want to trade one cage for another. Instead, I joined a nonprofit lab that built open audit tools, ugly, honest software designed to make manipulation expensive. Sometimes I still wore the empathy cuff, not because I trusted it, but because it reminded me of the simplest rule. Listen for intent, not applause. In a city that sold feelings, I chose something rarer. I chose proof. After Sarah's first article landed, the city reacted the way it always does. Outrage first, comprehension later. Morning shows invited ethicists to speak in tidy quotes. Influencers posted selfies wearing knockoff cuffs with captions about toxic energy. Meanwhile, people in the River District asked the simplest question. Does this mean a judge can take my kid because I'm scared? That question made the whole scandal feel less like tech and more like violence. I printed the question and taped it above my desk, because it was the only metric that mattered. Lumen Line's legal team moved quickly, not to correct the product, but to contain the narrative. They sent me a cease and desist claiming I had stolen proprietary information. They emailed my university, framing me as a disgruntled scholarship recipient who had violated data policies. They contacted the scholarship office and hinted that my service contract could be enforced for damages. In other words, they tried to make survival too expensive. June and I expected it. We had already separated the evidence into two categories: what we could share publicly and what would require subpoenas. We didn't need to win an argument. We needed to survive discovery. Sarah's newsroom assigned a lawyer to my case, a woman who spoke with the calm brutality of someone used to corporate bluffs. She told me, "They'll try to isolate you and make you feel guilty for existing. Don't negotiate in the dark. If they want something, make them request it in writing." That advice became my second rule. The first rule was intent. The second was paper. The State Tech Commission scheduled a preliminary hearing within a week. Lumenline's CEO arrived with a practiced smile and a slideshow about innovation, growth, and enhancing justice through data. He spoke as if fairness were a feature. I watched from the back row, wrists cold, hands steady. June sat beside me with a notebook full of hashes and timestamps. When the commission chair asked about bias testing, the CEO said they had robust safeguards. I heard the lie like static. Safeguards don't exist if they can be overwritten at 2:13 a.m. by a manager with a grudge. Rowan tried to erase my credibility before the hearing began. He leaked an internal memo claiming I had unauthorizedly modified the scoring model. The memo used my name like a stamp. It was meant to set a narrative baseline. Mira equals rogue. The problem was that he had timed it wrong. The night before the memo circulated, June and I had already given Sarah a packet showing Rowan's credentials in the logs during the exact hours the modifications occurred. So when the memo hit inboxes, Sarah's newsroom countered within hours. The public saw two stories side by side, a claim and a trail. In that comparison, the claim looked childish. In the hearing, the commission invited a family court judge who had participated in the pilot. He looked nervous. He said the cuff score had helped him assess sincerity. A public defender asked him whether the score correlated with income or race. The judge hesitated. Hesitation is the shape of doubt. June submitted a simple chart with anonymized pilot results showing error rates skewing against River District participants and against people flagged for anxiety. The commissioner asked how that could happen. June answered, "Calm is treated as honesty because wealth trains calm. Fear is treated as deception because poverty trains fear." The room went quiet. Sometimes the truth is not complicated. It is just rude. Lumenline's counsel argued that any bias was incidental and would be corrected in the next software update. Sarah's lawyer stood and said, "You cannot patch a product that is already being used to decide custody." The commissioner agreed, and the pilot was suspended on the spot. The CEO smiled through it, but his eyes had the flat anger of someone watching their leverage dissolve. The suspension triggered internal chaos. Employees began emailing each other about who leaked and what compliance knew. A few engineers quietly reached out to June with screenshots of internal chats. Rowan demanding changes, compliance telling people to stay aligned, executives pushing for launch dates that ignored safety concerns. The messages formed a chorus, not of guilt, but of institution. Lumenline had built a machine that converted hesitation into silence. The only way to break that machine was to show people that silence was no longer protective. Then came the retaliation that wasn't legal. A black sedan idled outside my building again, and this time the driver rolled down the window, just enough to show a phone camera pointed at me. The next day, a new anonymous account posted a photo of my front door with a caption about traitors. The post was removed within hours, but the message had been delivered. "We know where you sleep." I didn't call the police. I called Sarah. She forwarded the evidence to the commission's investigator, who forwarded it to a prosecutor. Bullying changes tone when it realizes there's a courtroom listening. Rowan called me from a private number again, voice gentle, like he was offering forgiveness. He said, "Mira, you don't understand the stakes. The city needs this product." He meant he needed it. I asked him to explain why his credentials were in the logs at 2:13 a.m. There was a pause. Then he said, "You're making enemies you can't afford." I recorded it. Threats sound different when you stop pretending they are advice. The class action suit formed the way storms form. Slowly, then all at once. Parents who had been judged insincere because they trembled. Public defenders who had watched clients lose custody while trying not to cry. Disability advocates furious that anxiety was being measured as deception. A coalition filed in state court and requested all pilot materials. Lumenline tried to claim trade secrets. The judge ordered production under protective conditions. Watching that order felt like watching a locked door finally open. During discovery, the worst details surfaced. The cuff scoring model was trained on data curated by consultants who had excluded outliers, a polite word for anyone who didn't behave like the wealthy. The training labels were based on human raters who assumed calm speech meant honesty. There were no audits for disability, no checks for class bias, no independent oversight. What Lumenline called empathy had been engineered to recognize power and call it virtue. The lawsuit's expert witness described it perfectly. This is phrenology with better branding. The scholarship program came under scrutiny too. A reporter found that dozens of scholarship recipients had signed service contracts with penalty clauses, effectively binding poor students to the company's will. When asked about it, the university administrator said the contracts were industry standard. The phrase made me laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. Industry standard is just collective audacity. Under pressure, the university announced an internal review. I had seen reviews before. They often end with a memo and nothing else. So I did what Sierra's lawyer taught me. I demanded the request in writing. I submitted a formal complaint with attachments, the service contract language, the HR emails threatening review, the badge deactivation, the timing around the hearing. I made it impossible to treat my complaint as a rumor. In the River District, we learn early that paperwork is armor. The university responded by convening a panel that included students, faculty, and an external labor attorney. In the first meeting, a dean asked why I hadn't raised concerns earlier. I told him the contract was designed to punish me for raising concerns. The dean looked uncomfortable, as if he'd stepped on a nail and wanted to pretend it was the floor's fault. The labor attorney asked to see the contract. When she read the penalty clause, she sighed and said, "This is indenture with modern typography." The panel went silent again. Silence, this time, was agreement. Inside Lumenline, compliance tried to salvage its role by offering to reinstate me if I signed a non-disclosure and returned all copied materials. They framed it as kindness. It was a trap. They wanted to reabsorb the evidence into the company's digestive system. June and I refused. We offered an alternative. We would hand over our mirror to investigators as an independent baseline, not to the company. Compliance's intent flared like a warning light. Regain control. When they couldn't, they pivoted to damage control and began scapegoating Rowan. Rowan resigned before he could be fired, issuing a statement about differences in vision. Lumenline praised his contributions and wished him well. It was corporate mercy for a man who had threatened a woman's life. The prosecutor did not share the mercy. With subpoenaed logs and recorded calls, they filed charges related to harassment, tampering, and obstruction. The case moved slowly, but it moved. Rowan's confidence evaporated in public, and the city learned something it rarely learns, that polish is not immunity. Meanwhile, the commission issued a temporary ban on the cuff's use in any judicial proceeding until independent audits were mandated. That decision rippled into other industries. A bank quietly paused a pilot that had planned to use cuff scores for loan approvals. An employer paused a team compatibility program. When you cut a product off from the courts, you also cut off its aura of legitimacy. And legitimacy is what lets bad tools spread. The class action settlement, when it arrived, was not poetic. It included monetary restitution for families affected by the pilot, funds for rehearings, and a requirement that any future behavior scoring tool used by public agencies must publish audit results and allow external verification. Lumenline didn't admit wrongdoing in the statement, but they agreed to the rules. I didn't care about admission. I cared about friction. Rules create friction, and friction slows harm. My scholarship contract was voided under public pressure, but freedom came with a strange aftertaste. I had spent my entire life with timers on my choices, rent due dates, utility shut-off warnings, scholarship clauses, and when one timer disappeared, I didn't know what to do with the extra air. My mother noticed. She said, "You don't have to fill every empty space with fear," I said. "I don't know how not to." She replied, "Then we learn." My mother wasn't educated in machine learning, but she was an expert in rebuilding. June and I decided not to chase positions at rival companies. Other firms offered money and titles, eager to hire the whistleblower engineer duo as a credibility trophy. We refused. We didn't want to become the marketing they replaced Rowan with. Instead, we joined the nonprofit lab and focused on making auditing tools available to anyone with a laptop and a reason to question power. The lab's first months were brutally practical. We wrote documentation in plain language. We built an interface for non-technical users. We partnered with public defenders who tested our tool in mock hearings and told us which explanations made sense under pressure. One defender said, "If I can't explain it in 30 seconds to a judge who wants to move on, it's useless." So we made it explainable in 30 seconds. It wasn't beautiful. It was effective. When the City Council proposed a new ordinance to require audits for emotion-scoring devices sold to public agencies, they invited testimony. Sierra told me I didn't have to go. I went anyway. In my statement, I didn't talk about feelings. I talked about logs. I talked about who gets excluded from calm by definition. I talked about how poverty trains your body to look guilty because your body is always braced. I ended with a sentence that surprised even me. If you buy a device that claims to measure sincerity, you are buying a weapon that will be aimed at whoever your city already distrusts. The council chamber was quiet. Then someone clapped once. Then others followed. I ignored the applause. I watched the intent shift in the room from curiosity to responsibility. By the time we finished drafting the ordinance language with the council's counsel, I had learned that policy is just code written in legal syntax. It needs tests. It needs adversarial thinking. It needs maintenance. It needs people willing to argue about edge cases. Because edge cases are where humans live. And I realized I was good at that work. Not because I loved conflict, but because I had survived being treated like an edge case my whole life. Even with legal momentum, day-to-day life stayed sharp. I took different routes to the grocery store. I avoided predictable schedules. I learned which neighbors would open their doors if I knocked twice. The River District has its own security system. People who notice, people who remember faces, people who treat community as a contract. One evening, a teenager from downstairs warned me that someone had asked for my unit number at the corner bodega. I thanked him and slipped him a meal voucher, then immediately wrote down the time, the description, the exact phrasing. Recording details became less like paranoia and more like citizenship in a hostile environment. Sierra taught me how to manage public attention without surrendering to it. She said, "Don't correct every lie. Correct the lies that can become policy." That meant letting strangers call me a traitor on the internet, while focusing on ensuring that the commission's findings couldn't be quietly watered down. She showed me how lobbying works. Smiling meetings, draft edits, footnotes where accountability goes to die. Every time a clause tried to turn an audit requirement into a suggestion, June and I rewrote it back into an obligation. We didn't win because we were loud. We won because we were stubborn and specific. Rowan's allies attempted a softer sabotage. They offered to fund the nonprofit lab if we agreed to consult with a new corporate consortium writing ethical standards. The standards document was full of beautiful words: transparency, responsibility, trust. The problem was the definition section. Transparency meant internal review. Responsibility meant good faith efforts. Trust meant customer satisfaction. We declined the consortium and published a critique, explaining, line by line, how vague standards become shields. Our critique wasn't viral, it was useful. In the months that followed, several city agencies cited it when rejecting vendor proposals. The cuff itself became a symbol in debates it didn't deserve. People argued as if the device were magic or evil, as if it were a spirit. I kept telling anyone who asked that it was simpler. It was a sensor suite paired with a model trained on biased labels. It wasn't reading souls. It was reading class-coded behavior and calling it morality. Once you understand that, you stop fearing the device and start fearing the incentives around it. The most complicated part was forgiveness. Specifically, forgiving the version of me who almost gave Rowan what he wanted at that dinner table. When I remembered the hidden camera, the lawyer's throat clearing, the counsel aide's discomfort, I still felt a flare of shame, as if being targeted were evidence of weakness. My therapist called that internalized blame. She asked me to list what I had done right. I asked about recording. I demanded writing. I secured logs. I built a mirror. I refused to hand evidence to compliance. I found a journalist who respected documents. The list was longer than my shame wanted to admit. When I finally believed my own list, my shoulders loosened, like a rope had been cut. June, who had always been treated as difficult, started receiving invitations he didn't trust. Panels, podcasts, keynote speeches. He said yes to one panel and regretted it immediately when the host tried to turn the story into a redemption arc for the company. June walked off stage mid-question. Later he apologized to me for causing drama. I told him leaving a room that's trying to use you is not drama. It's hygiene. We laughed, and that laughter felt like a new kind of partnership, one built on shared refusal. The ordinance passed with amendments that were weaker than we wanted but stronger than the market preferred. It required independent audits for emotion scoring tools used by public agencies, mandated disclosure of training data categories, and established penalties for vendors who withheld documentation. The penalties were not as severe as I'd hoped, but they existed, which meant future vendors would have to price accountability into their business models. That was a win. Small wins accumulate like interest. Afterward, I walked home through streets lined with billboards that still sold feeling as a product. The slogans hadn't changed, but I had. I knew now that most power is not a secret cabal. It's a set of defaults nobody questions because questioning is exhausting. By forcing one set of defaults to change, we had proven that defaults are not destiny. A month later, a child welfare advocate emailed to say that her organization had updated its training. Judges and caseworkers were warned not to treat physiological arousal as deception, and they were taught how trauma changes bodies. Reading that, I felt something close to relief. The cuff had been a threat because it validated prejudice. Teaching people the science of fear removed some of that validation. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. Sierra asked if I wanted to write a memoir. I said no. I wasn't interested in selling my pain back to a city that treats pain as content. I told her I'd rather write user guides and audit templates. She rolled her eyes and said, "You're impossible." I said, "I'm cautious." She smiled and replied, "Fine. Be cautious. Just don't disappear." So I didn't disappear. I chose visibility with limits. Public work, private life. I used a P.O. box. I avoided posting photos outside. I asked friends not to tag my location. Boundaries, I learned, are not paranoia. They are design. When systems try to harvest you, you design yourself to be harder to harvest. One winter night, June and I received a message from an engineer still inside Lumen Line. He said he'd been asked to build a V2 cuff with a feature called compliance mode, an option to suppress uncertainty ranges in the score to make results look cleaner. The engineer asked if that was normal. I stared at the message and felt my stomach drop. Clean results are the oldest lie in statistics. I told him to preserve every instruction he received, keep copies outside corporate servers, and contact the commission investigator if pressure escalated. We provided him a checklist and a secure way to upload materials. He thanked us and said he'd been afraid no one would believe him. I told him, "Belief is overrated. Bring proof." Months later, that engineer's documentation triggered a second investigation that prevented Lumen Line from quietly relaunching under new branding. The company eventually sold the cuff division to a defense contractor and rebranded as an insights platform. The markets applauded the pivot. I did not. I understood the pivot as evacuation. Move the risky product to a sector that is harder to regulate. We wrote a public warning and sent it to legislators. Some ignored it, some listened. In policy work, you plant seeds knowing not all of them sprout. The nonprofit lab expanded its mission. We built an open-source bias budget tool that forced any vendor to quantify how much error it was willing to tolerate and against whom. We built a consent ledger that logged where biometric data traveled and who could access it. We built trainings for public agencies on procurement questions to ask before buying shiny tech. None of it made headlines. That was good. Headlines attract predators. And somewhere in all that unglamorous work, I realized I had stopped measuring my worth by whether powerful people approved of me. I had spent my entire scholarship life chasing approval, because approval meant survival. Now survival came from other things: allies, documentation, and systems designed to be harder to corrupt. The shift was subtle, but it changed my sleep. I began to sleep through the night without waking to check the door. On the anniversary of the hearing, my mother cooked noodles again and invited neighbors who had watched my building for months. They didn't ask for speeches. They just ate, argued about sports, and teased me for working too hard. When I finally stood up to clear plates, my mother said, "Sit. Let someone else carry something." I sat. It felt strange, but it also felt like trust. Later, when I walked June to the subway, he asked what I would do if the city stopped caring about audits. I said, "Then we keep building anyway, because even if the city forgets, someone in the future will need a door, and doors are made one hinge at a time." June nodded, and I could tell he understood. The best systems aren't built when everyone is watching. They're built when no one is. After the ordinance passed, I received a letter from a woman I'd never met. She wrote that her sister had lost custody years earlier because she cried in court and a judge called her manipulative. The letter said, "Your work won't give my sister her time back, but it might stop the next judge from confusing fear with deceit." I read the letter twice and then placed it in the same folder where I kept the original access logs. Different kind of evidence, same purpose: to prove that outcomes have bodies attached to them. June and I also built a small courtroom sandbox for training. We simulated how stress changes pulse, breath, and voice, then showed how the cuffs model interpreted those changes as suspicion. In one session, a young clerk volunteered and watched her own sincerity score drop as she spoke about a childhood memory. She looked horrified, then angry. That anger was useful. Anger, when informed, becomes a boundary. The clerk later helped push an internal memo through the court system warning against biometric shortcuts. Bureaucracy moves slowly, but it moves when enough people inside it feel personally implicated. I kept thinking about the dinner table, because that was where the trap had first been staged. I had entered expecting a celebration and left carrying a script in my head. Now, whenever a new celebratory invitation arrived, an awards dinner, a keynote, a corporate retreat, I asked one question before replying: who benefits from my presence? If the answer was not the work, I declined. Declining became a skill. It did not make me lonely. It made me free. The last loose end was Rowan's attempt to disappear. After his resignation, he tried to consult for smaller startups, selling himself as a product visionary who had been misunderstood. Sarah found a pitch deck where he described the scandal as proof that he was disruptive. That framing turning harm into charisma was familiar. We didn't chase him with rage. We chased him with documentation. We sent the deck and the recorded threat to the licensing board that certified vendors for court tech. The board opened a review and quietly denied his application. It wasn't jail. It wasn't a headline. It was a closed door. Sometimes justice is simply preventing a repeat performance. The nonprofit lab's work began showing up in places I didn't expect. A procurement officer in another city emailed to say our audit checklist had helped her reject a truth-scoring vendor before the contract was signed. A civil rights group translated our Exit Without Shame guide into 3 languages and distributed it at shelters. A graduate student built a thesis around our bias budget tool and improved it, then sent us the code without asking for credit. Those were the moments that made me believe systems can change, not because one person is brave, but because many people add small reinforcements until the structure holds. On nights when fear returned, because fear never fully leaves, it just becomes less persuasive. I opened my old backup folder and looked at the first log entry that mattered. Rowan's credentials, 213A. M. A timestamp that had once felt like a sentence. Now it felt like an origin story for a different kind of life. I realized then that proof does more than win cases. Proof reshapes memory. It turns the past from a fog of doubt into a map you can navigate without getting lost in shame. Later, June admitted he had been labeled difficult for years because he refused to sign off on metrics he couldn't reproduce. I told him reproducibility is just courage expressed through math, and we built our work around that principle. Every claim had to be checkable, every score had to have a reason, and every dashboard had to reveal what it hid. The nonprofit lab we joined was small, underfunded, and allergic to hero stories, which made it the safest place I'd ever worked. Our first tool was not glamorous. A verifier that made model behavior legible to non-engineers, judges, public defenders, social workers, people whose decisions had been turned into markets by companies like Lumenline. We designed it to answer one question quickly. If you change the data or the thresholds, who gets punished? Sarah Quinn kept her promise to protect the evidence rather than the ego. She refused to quote me when she didn't need to. Instead, she published timelines, diffs, and clean screenshots that let the public see what innovation had actually meant. Bias packaged as a product. Rowan's supporters tried to rewrite the story as a misunderstanding, but the verifier made spin expensive. When anyone asked, "How do we know this is true?" we could hand them a link that answered without rhetoric. The company's PR team learned that arguments are softer than hashes. The pilot suspension did not erase harm. During the brief trial phase, a handful of families had already been pressured by the cuff's so-called sincerity scores. We partnered with public defenders who knew exactly how often truth is priced out of courtrooms. And together we built a remediation workflow. Identify cases where the cuff influenced a decision, notify counsel, offer rehearings, and fund independent evaluations. Fairness, I learned, is not a vibe. It is a sequence of checkpoints that refuses to let prejudice travel uninspected. Because Lumenline had tried to use my scholarship contract as a leash, We created a separate project for scholarship recipients across the city, students bound to service clauses that turned gratitude into captivity. We wrote a plain language guide called Exit Without Shame: how to read a contract, how to document retaliation, how to escalate safely, how to find pro bono counsel, how to create a paper trail that survives executive smiles. We didn't publish it with my name on the cover. We published it as a tool, because tools don't get tempted by applause. The retaliation didn't stop neatly. A private investigator visited my building twice, asking neighbors if I was unstable and whether I took medication. The questions were designed to create a rumor where none existed. I asked the neighbors to write down what was said, when, and by whom. Then I added those notes to my own file. Threats rarely arrive as violence first. They arrive as inconvenience, as policy, as doors that stop opening. Once you see that pattern, you stop treating inconveniences as accidents. You treat them as intent. One morning, a judge reached out privately. He said the pilot had made him uneasy because he could feel his own bias being validated by a score, and that feeling had scared him. He asked for training, not a press release. We built a workshop that showed how algorithms borrow authority from institutions and return prejudice with a stamp. The judge attended with his clerks and left without shaking hands, as if gratitude might compromise him. That was fine. Prevention is cheaper than apology, and humility is rarer than praise. We also learned to refuse money the way we had learned to refuse narratives. Corporate sponsors offered grants with silence clauses tucked into footnotes. The money would have bought better laptops and more staff, but it would have bought their comfort too. Every time we said no, we lost money and gained room to breathe, which is the only kind of funding that doesn't rot. Some nights I lay awake calculating budgets the way I used to calculate risk, and I realized budgeting and survival have the same core skill: deciding what you will not sacrifice. The River District heard about our work in the way neighborhoods hear about anything that matters. Through aunties, corner stores, late-night phone calls, they held a small celebration for me that looked nothing like the glamorous victories on television. There were noodles, folding chairs, and people who didn't know my title but knew what it costs to be dismissed. An older neighbor squeezed my hand and said, quietly, "We needed to see someone win without becoming cruel." I laughed once and then swallowed hard, because I hadn't realized how hungry my own community was for proof that dignity can survive conflict. My mother framed the Tech Commission's public letter like it was a diploma, not because she trusted institutions she never had, but because she believed in collecting evidence of dignity whenever it appeared. She hung it beside my childhood report cards, as if to tell every visitor that her daughter had been allowed to matter in public, just once. I stared at the frame for a long time and thought about how many mothers never get that moment, because the system buys their children's silence early. I visited the old Lumen Line building once, months after the headlines faded. Employees rushed through the lobby with tired faces, eyes on phones, shoulders braced like they were carrying invisible weights. I didn't hate them. I just hoped they would learn faster than I did that loyalty without accountability is a trap. The building looked the same: glass, light, slogans on the walls, but the aura had changed. When a company gets caught lying about care, the lie lingers in the air even after the posters are replaced. Sierra told me later that she used to hate whistleblowers because half of them wanted fame. She respected the ones who brought clean timelines and let documents speak louder than ego. I told her that ego is a luxury for people who have never had their survival negotiated at a dinner table. She snorted and said she'd quote me if I ever gave her permission. I didn't. I didn't want the city to remember me as a headline. I wanted the city to remember the workflow. The biggest quiet victory arrived in an email from a public defender. A custody case had been reopened, and the judge had explicitly noted that device-derived sincerity scores were inadmissible without transparent audit. It was a small line in a long order, but it was a line that protected people who would never know my name. That was the kind of outcome I wanted. Not a statue, not a TED Talk, just a rule that made it harder to turn fear into profit. Sometimes I still wore the empathy cuff. Not for its predictions, I no longer trusted any device that promised to read souls, but as a reminder of the simplest rule that saved me. Listen for intent, not applause. Applause can be bought, staged, edited, optimized. Intent leaves footprints in logs, in access times, in who gets punished and who gets promoted. When you learn to read those footprints, you stop begging to be believed. You start building proofs that force belief to follow. In a city that sold feelings the way it sold coffee, I learned something steadier than empathy. I learned accountability. And when accountability is shared, when it becomes a tool anyone can use, it stops being a scandal and starts being a habit. That is how silence gets broken for good. Not by one brave speech, but by systems that make secrecy too expensive to maintain.